So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Day to Day Around the House. In this video, I'm going to go over how I make my connections using wire nuts. The reason for this is I've been doing a lot of house electrical projects, and instead of having to go over this information in every video I do, for safety reasons, I figured I'd do a video just pertaining to this, and I can post it at the end of all my videos to simplify the process. Now, I am not a licensed electrician, but I have been doing DIY projects around my houses for the last 20 plus years, including ceiling fans, wiring in outlets, running 220 outlets, wiring in new light fixtures, etc. And I've never had a problem with any of the DIY projects that I've done. I'm going to show you what a good connection looks like and what some bad connections can look like and what can happen if you make those bad connections, including things I've done in the past that were incorrect as well. So let's get to it. So one of the most critical things to pay attention to when using wire nuts is that you use the appropriate size. You don't want one that's too small where not all the wires can get pushed in evenly to the wire nut. You also don't want one too big where it doesn't put a good grip on the wires as you try and tighten it down. They also come in a couple different styles. I actually prefer the ones that have these two little extra tabs on them because it helps me torque that down by hand a little bit better than the ones that don't have it. So a lot of times if you're doing a ceiling fan, which is a pretty common DIY, you're going to have the braided wire, and then in your house, you're going to have the hard wire. So these are okay to connect with a wire nut. You just want to make sure you have equal lengths of the hard and the braided wire stripped back. So as I talked about before, one of the biggest problems is not using the proper size wire nut. So right here, I thought this one would be good, but it's not tightening down. I can just keep spinning and spinning and spinning. So that's too big of a wire nut. So I grabbed one size smaller wire nut and started threading it on, and it immediately started getting tight. I do like to tighten these down until it basically stops me or it starts twisting the wire a little bit, letting me know I've got a good connection. So I'm going to take this wire nut back off so you can see the connection that was made by doing that. That braided wire is twisted around that hard wire really well, and that's even after it loosened up on me a little bit while I was taking the nut off. So here's another example of one I put in and then took off. You can see how well those are bound together. If for whatever reason you've got two braided wires, you can also use a wire nut for this. I like to put a couple twists on those if you're just doing two braided wires together. Just make sure you don't use too big of a wire nut, and I again tighten these down until I see the wire start to twist, letting me know that it's a good tight connection. If I'm doing two soft wire connections, I actually prefer just to do a butt connector on those. Just personal preference, but the only time this is a good idea is if you're doing the two braided wires. Another way to go in that situation is these wire end caps that are actually crimp-on. So a couple common mistakes and obviously these are exaggerated a little bit, is not stripping back enough of the wiring when you're doing a wire nut. So right here, these aren't stripped back nearly far enough. So as I tighten these down, what's going to happen is you're actually tightening it down on the insulation and not on the actual copper itself. So that's not going to give you a very good connection. You see how it's fraying the insulation here? That's because I didn't have enough stripped back and the wire nut was actually tightening down on the insulation, which can lead to a bad connection or a weak connection. The other thing, the opposite of that, is stripping back too much. So right here's an example of that. So you tighten this wire nut down and you've got all this excess bare wire hanging out below the wire nut, and therefore a better chance of something possibly shorting out to it. So you end up with something like that. So once again, this is not what you want to see. Another somewhat easy mistake that can be made is you use too small of a gauge stripper to trim back the insulation off your wire, and then what can happen over time is that connection could possibly break inside your outlet box and then short out to something else. So right here I've got two of them cut back about 3/4 of an inch, and it almost looks like that's going to be too much, but as you tighten these down, they'll kind of twist into each other, and we should be covering all the way to the insulation. So you can see I'm tightening that one down. We're already down to the insulation. Now on the thicker wires, they might not twist together, or it's harder to get the wires to actually twist together. When you tighten these down, you should not be able to keep spinning these. They should basically stop you, especially if you're just doing it by hand. Or it's going to start twisting the wire, and that lets you know you got a pretty damn good connection as well. So there, right there, I'm twisting the wire. Now notice I put those on straight, and watch what these are going to look like when we take this off. They're actually going to be twisted together. So that's a really good connection right there. And then always, after making a connection, I'll even pull these back out so they're not twisted together. You want to tug on these really good and make sure you don't feel any looseness or none of them come out. There's some other ones that I did that we had a really good tight connection on. So here's an example. I've got 2 hard wires plus a braided wire, and I used this orange connector, which was a little too small. So what was happening with this one is as I tightened it down, the 2 hard wires were getting pulled up nice and tight, but it was actually pushing the braided wire off as I tightened it down. So right here, I took that back off using the same wires and just got a little bigger wire nut. You can see the different size in the yellow versus the orange. As I tightened that yellow one down, all 3 were getting pulled in at the same time, and it made a nice, good, tight connection. So next, I'm going to loosen up this yellow wire nut, and I'm actually going to put one on that is too big, and you can see what happens when I do that. Now keep in mind, this is the exact same wires that I just loosened that yellow wing nut off of. And right here, you can see how easily I pulled that braided wire out of that wire connection. Now the last example I have of something to really watch out for is making sure when you put a wire nut on that all of the wires are pushed up at the same length so they all enter the wire nut at the same time. In this example, I had 2 wires pushed up and then the one back about 1/4 of an inch from the other 2, and look what happens. So now I'm going to loosen that wire nut and use the exact same 3 wires and the exact wire nut all pushed up evenly and tighten it down, and you can see how much leverage I'm putting on those wires and nothing is moving or pulling out of that wire nut. One other thing I do that isn't absolutely necessary, but I just do it as another layer of protection for the connections, is add electrical tape around the wire nut and then down across some of the wire and back up to the wire nut. Just as a little extra holding force to help hold those wires to make sure they're not going to come out of that connection. It also adds a layer of protection if you have any possible bare wire sticking out past the bottom of that wire nut to keep it from shorting out to something. So a couple of things to watch out for. If you're using wire nuts, most likely you're going to be working in an outlet box or a light fixture box. If they are metal, you want to make sure that the wires are going through one of these protectors. And basically what that does is without that protector, your Romex wire could wear through and cut into the hot wire, which could create a short to ground, which also, again, could create heat and a possible fire hazard. And the other thing, when it's possible, is if you've got your commons and your neutrals and your grounds, it's a good idea in your outlet or wiring boxes to put your hot wires to one side of the box and your ground and commons to the other side. This is just another example. If you had something like this going on in a hot wire and they're stacked on top of each other like that, you could create a short as well. Whereas if they're on opposite sides, that's less likely to happen. Obviously, depending on how congested the box is, you might not be able to do that, but it is a good practice to do when it's possible. So here's some actual footage of me doing some work inside my house. This is a metal ceiling box kit, and it actually had our dining room table light over it. However, we moved the dining room table, and therefore the light had to move too. So I installed another ceiling box kit over the dining room table and then ran some Romex wire from the old location over to the new one. So this is basically becoming a junction block and going to be covered by a plastic cover. So one thing I didn't do correctly when I first installed this light fixture years ago was I did not ground to the metal box. So I did that this time and then connected the 2 grounds together with that extra ground going to the box and connected the 2 hot leads and the 2 commons together. On another quick note, if you don't feel you have good hand strength, you can always take a pair of pliers to help do the final twist on the wire nut so you make sure you've got a good tight connection. And then of course I have wrapped all my connections with electrical tape. And when I put everything up in the box, I did keep my hot leads on the opposite side of the box as my ground and commons. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Hopefully it helped you out and gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. If you are thinking of doing a DIY project involving electricity and you felt like you didn't get enough information out of this video involving wire nuts or how to hook those up, Make sure you research it further before tackling that project, because any type of a weak connection or loose connection can create heat, and heat with electricity can be a possible fire hazard. As with all my videos, guys, I try and give the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time, and I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.